Hello, everyone. Today I'm continuing my discussion on the First World War, and this time I'm moving more into the Eastern Front to talk about some of the lesser known battles and political things at the time going on, mainly regarding the Russian Empire. So first I looked at David Schrödinger, who wrote The Bear in the Room, Gallipoli, Russia, and the First World War. And he notes that while the Gallipoli campaign is mainly looked back on now from the view of the Anzac troops and the British, and of course regarded as a bloody catastrophe, it's important also to remember that the Gallipoli campaign was also a British response to a direct Russian request for help, as the Ottoman Turkish blockade was preventing Russian grain and oil from being exported out and harming the economy. In addition, the Russians were also fighting the Ottomans in the Caucasus Mountains and needed some relief. So the British were more than happy to send troops to assist in distracting the Ottomans to allow the Russians to win and keep them in the fight, fearing that otherwise, if the Germans crushed the Russians in the east, they would then redirect troops elsewhere to the Western Front and overwhelm the Allies. At the same time, this was a clever strategy for the British to try and gain access to Russian grain imports to feed the Western Front. Michael A. Reynolds, who writes The East's Eastern Front, goes into more depth about the Ottoman and Russian clashes and presents this as the culmination of several wars over the centuries between the Russians and the Ottomans, and a continued imperial rivalry that unfortunately had a negative impact on minorities used within each of the empires by the opposing side that had a catastrophic impact on those populations. Ultimately, the thing that those empires feared most was internal collapse, which of course happened. But ultimately, for both, the end of World War I did not bring in a new era of peace, but rather civil war in the case of Russia and later Soviet despotism. And in regards to the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish War of Independence followed the end of World War I. Paul Dukes writes Remembering Russia's Great War, and this was interesting because he talks about how, of course, after World War I came to an end, the events of the Russian Revolution and Civil War overshadowed any memory within the Soviet Union of the Russian contribution to the war effort. So many memorials and literary pieces or historical writings on the Russian contribution in World War I were coming from outside of the country for the longest period of time. Really, only the Red Army discussed World War I occasionally when studying strategy against the Germans. Granted, this ultimately was revived with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The memory of World War I was used by Putin to try and usher in a new era of Russian patriotism, but even then is still overshadowed by the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians refer to the Second World War. And then there's Reinhard Nachtigall, who wrote a current historiography on Eastern Europe during the First World War, a review. So again, looking into the Eastern Front, Reinhard Nachtigall actually goes even further, examining the Forgotten Front, as he calls it, the populations right on the contact line between the Russians and the Germans of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, and of course the impact of civilians and the displacement they suffered during the war, as well as all the violence that accompanied that. But he speaks of World War I in those countries or populations' memories is something that's more on national lines. So for Poles and Ukrainians, they might more fondly look back upon the German occupation of World War I compared to the Nazis, and certainly compared to the Russian occupation both countries had endured, or the Soviet occupation later on. Poles and Ukrainians also, of course, are thinking of World War I as not something that ended for them cleanly, but rather that ended as a war for them in 1917, and then gave way to smaller conflicts along ethnic lines, mainly the ill-fated Polish and Ukrainian campaigns for independence, which of course later were overrun by the Nazis and the Soviet Union. So this is very interesting for me to look into beyond just the Western Front, which is much more widely talked about. Thank you.